The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick cream paper with embossed lettering that read, Morrison & Associates, Estate Attorneys. My name, Clara Bennett, was written in elegant script just below the firm's address. I held it against the kitchen window, the morning light filtering through the paper, already knowing what it contained before I broke the wax seal. But before I tell you about what changed everything that day, let me know where you're following this story from. Are you listening while commuting, relaxing at home, or perhaps taking a quiet moment during your lunch break? If you're enjoying these everyday stories of family, love, and unexpected turns, I'd love to have you along for the journey. Your support means everything to storytellers like me. 3 weeks had passed since Grandmother Rose's funeral. 3 weeks since I'd watched my sister Victoria glide through the receiving line in her perfectly tailored black dress, accepting condolences like she was the sole heir to our grandmother's memory. Mother had mentioned the will reading with her usual brisk efficiency. It's just a formality, Clara. Victoria will inherit the estate, of course. Rose always favored her. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they carried the weight of assumed truth. I didn't argue. I'd learned long ago that challenging Mother's pronouncements was like throwing stones into fog. They disappeared without making a sound, leaving only the echo of your own futility. Instead, I folded the letter and tucked it into my jacket pocket, feeling the crisp edges against my fingers as I walked to work. Victoria had always been the golden child, the one whose name sparkled in every conversation about our family's future. Victoria made Dean's List again. Victoria's internship at the law firm is going wonderfully. Victoria's engagement party will be at the country club. Her achievements hung on our parents' walls like trophies, each one polished and prominently displayed. I wasn't resentful, not exactly. I'd simply learned to find my place in the spaces between her spotlight moments. While she dazzled at dinner parties and charity galas, I discovered quiet corners, the library's reading nook, Grandmother Rose's garden shed, the attic where old photo albums gathered dust. These became my sanctuaries, places where I didn't need to compete with Victoria's radiance. Grandmother Rose was different. She never asked me to speak louder or shine brighter. She'd slip me small treasures during family gatherings, a pressed flower from her garden, a vintage postcard from places she'd dreamed of visiting, a small wooden box with a hidden compartment. Keep this safe, she'd whisper, her eyes twinkling with shared secrets. Some things are meant for quiet keepers. The last time I saw her was on a chilly afternoon in November. I'd brought her a batch of lavender scones from the bakery downtown, the kind with real butter and a hint of lemon zest. We sat in her sunroom, surrounded by her collection of African violets, watching the first snow dust her garden. We didn't talk much. We never needed to. She understood that some people spoke in silences, and I was fluent in her particular dialect of unspoken affection. As I prepared to leave that day, she pressed something into my palm, a small brass key, warm from her touch. "This opens more than you think," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Not everything valuable needs to be announced, dear one." I slipped the key into my wallet, next to my driver's license, and forgot about it until now. The funeral had been a production, as everything involving Victoria tended to be. She'd organized the flowers, chosen the music, and delivered a eulogy that brought tears to everyone's eyes, including mine. She spoke of Grandmother Rose's legacy, her strength, her unwavering support of family. She spoke beautifully, as she always did, but something felt rehearsed, polished for public consumption. I'd sat in the back pew, listening to the whispered conversations around me. Such a shame Clara never spent much time with Rose. I heard they barely spoke in recent years. At least Victoria was always so devoted. The words washed over me like rain on glass, present but unable to penetrate the quiet certainty I carried about my relationship with my grandmother. Now, staring at the formal invitation to the will reading, I felt that old familiar tug, not of expectation, but of belonging. I wasn't going because I thought I'd inherit anything meaningful. I was going because Grandmother Rose had asked me to be there, through this letter, through that brass key still tucked in my wallet, through all those quiet afternoons when she'd simply let me exist in her presence without needing to explain myself. I circled the date on my calendar, Friday, 2 p.m. Victoria would be there in her power suit, our parents flanking her like proud sentries. I would wear my simple navy dress and sit wherever they pointed me, carrying nothing but the weight of all those unspoken conversations and the strange, persistent feeling that this was exactly where I was supposed to be. The morning light shifted, casting long shadows across my kitchen table. I made myself a cup of tea, Earl Grey with honey, just like Grandmother Rose preferred, and settled into the day, the letter's words echoing in my mind. "You have been named among the interested parties." Interested parties. Such a formal way to describe the messy, complicated love that exists between family members. the kind that doesn't always fit into neat categories or legal documents. But maybe, I thought as I sipped my tea, that was exactly the point. Friday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes everything feel sharper, more defined. I stood before my bedroom mirror, smoothing the wrinkles from my navy dress, the same one I'd worn to job interviews and dinner dates that never led anywhere. It wasn't expensive, but it was honest, which felt appropriate for what lay ahead. The Morrison & Associates building sat in the heart of downtown Millbrook, its red brick facade weathered by decades of New England winters. I arrived 15 minutes early, a habit inherited from years of being the one who waited for others to notice me. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, directed me to the conference room on the third floor. Victoria was already there, naturally. She sat at the polished mahogany table like she belonged in rooms like this, her charcoal blazer perfectly tailored, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon. Our parents flanked her, mother in her pearls and navy suit, father checking his phone with the distracted air of someone managing important business. They looked like a photograph from a lifestyle magazine. The perfect American family handles estate matters. "Clara," mother said, her tone polite but distant, "you're early." "Traffic was lighter than expected," I replied, taking a seat near the window, away from their tight cluster. The October light filtered through the glass, casting golden rectangles across the table. Victoria glanced at me with what might have been curiosity or assessment. "I didn't think you'd actually come," she said, not unkindly, just matter of fact. "I mean, you and Grandmother Rose weren't exactly close." The comment landed like a small stone in still water, creating ripples I wasn't sure how to address. How do you explain a relationship built on shared silences? On understanding? That doesn't require words. How do you describe afternoons spent in comfortable quiet, reading books while someone you love tends to her garden just outside the window? "We were close in our own way," I said simply. Father looked up from his phone. "Well, this shouldn't take long." Rose was always practical about these things. Clear-cut decisions. Before anyone could respond, the door opened and Mr. Morrison entered. A distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades delivering life-changing news to families. He carried a leather portfolio and wore the expression of practiced neutrality that lawyers perfect over years of witnessing human drama. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming. I'll begin with the formal reading of Rose Catherine Bennett's last will and testament, dated September 15th of this year." September 15th. I remembered that date. It was 2 days after my last visit with her, the afternoon we'd shared scones and watched the snow begin to fall. Had she already decided then? Had she been thinking about this while we sat in comfortable silence? Mr. Morrison opened his portfolio and withdrew several documents. Mrs. Bennett was very specific about her wishes and updated her will quite recently, with full mental capacity and proper legal witnesses. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the table. She had the look of someone expecting good news, someone who'd never doubted her place in the world's affections. To my granddaughter Victoria Bennett, Mr. Morrison read, "I leave my collection of antique jewelry, including the pearl necklace that belonged to her great-grandmother, and the sum of $50,000 to be used toward her wedding expenses and future endeavors." Victoria's smile was immediate and warm. "That's so generous," she said, glancing at our parents, who nodded approvingly. The jewelry alone was worth a considerable sum. I'd seen Mother admiring those pieces for years, especially the pearl necklace that Victoria had always assumed would be hers. To my son-in-law Robert and daughter-in-law Margaret, Mr. Morrison continued, "I leave $10,000 each with my gratitude for raising 2 strong daughters." Father nodded professionally. Mother's smile was tight but pleased. Everything was proceeding exactly as they'd expected, following the familiar script of family hierarchy and assumed affection. Mr. Morrison turned the page, and something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. Victoria was examining her manicure, already mentally planning how to incorporate the inheritance into her wedding next spring. Our parents were exchanging satisfied glances. "To my granddaughter Clara Marie Bennett," Mr. Morrison said, and the room went still. I felt my name in the air like a foreign word, unexpected in this context. Victoria looked up from her nails. Father's phone disappeared into his pocket. Mother's smile became fixed, polite, but confused. "I leave my home at 847 Maple Ridge Road, including all furnishings and personal effects, along with my investment portfolio valued at approximately $1.2 million, and controlling interest in Bennett and Associates Consulting." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes earthquakes, complete, profound, and filled with the sense that everything solid was about to shift. I stared at Mr. Morrison, certain I'd misheard him. Bennett and Associates was Grandmother Rose's business, the consulting firm she'd built from nothing after grandfather's death. It was successful, established, worth more than everything else combined. "I'm sorry," Victoria said, her voice carefully controlled. "Could you repeat that?" Mr. Morrison's expression remained neutral. Clara Bennett inherits the primary estate, including the family home, investment accounts, and the business. Mother made a sound like she was choking on air. Father leaned back in his chair as if he'd been pushed. Victoria's composure cracked just slightly around the edges. "There must be some mistake," Mother said. "Rose always intended for Victoria to inherit the estate. They discussed it many times." "There's no mistake," Mr. Morrison replied calmly. "Mrs. Bennett was very clear about her intentions. She underwent a full mental competency evaluation before making these changes. Everything is properly documented and witnessed." Victoria's hands were no longer perfectly folded. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table, and for the first time in my memory, she looked genuinely uncertain. "But why?" she asked, her voice smaller than usual. "I don't understand. I was the one who visited regularly, who called every week, who performed beautifully," I said quietly, the words emerging before I could stop them. The room turned toward me like a spotlight swiveling to find its target. I hadn't meant to speak, hadn't planned those words, but they hung in the air with the weight of truth. "Clara," Father said, his voice carrying a warning. But Mr. Morrison was reaching into his portfolio again. "Mrs. Bennett left specific instructions for me to share something with the family." He withdrew a sealed envelope, cream-colored and elegant, with my name written in Grandmother Rose's familiar handwriting. She asked that this be read aloud, in the presence of everyone. My heart began to race. Whatever was in that letter, whatever Grandmother Rose had felt compelled to explain, it was about to change everything, not just the inheritance but the story our family had been telling about itself for years. Mr. Morrison opened the envelope carefully and unfolded a single sheet of paper. When he began to read, his voice carried the unmistakable cadence of my grandmother's words, as if she were speaking directly to us from beyond the grave. Mr. Morrison's voice filled the conference room as he began to read Grandmother Rose's letter, each word falling into the silence like stones into deep water. "My dear family," he read, "if you are hearing this, then you are likely confused, perhaps even angry about my final decisions. I understand that my choices may seem unexpected, but I want you to know they were made with careful consideration and deep love for all of you." Victoria's face had gone pale, her usual composure cracking like ice under pressure. Mother sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Father stared at the table, his jaw working silently. Mr. Morrison continued, "Victoria, my dear granddaughter, you have always been the bright star of our family. Your accomplishments are numerous and worthy of celebration. You have your mother's drive and your father's ambition, and I have no doubt you will build a wonderful life for yourself. The jewelry I leave you belonged to 4 generations of strong women in our family. Wear it knowing you carry their strength with you." A small sob escaped Victoria's throat, but she pressed her lips together, refusing to let it become anything larger. However, Mr. Morrison read on, "I have come to understand that there are different kinds of love, different ways of showing devotion. For years I watched as Clara was overlooked, dismissed as the quiet one, the one who didn't shine as brightly in public spaces. But I saw something in her that others missed. She loved without expecting applause." I felt the weight of everyone's stares, but I kept my eyes fixed on Mr. Morrison's hands holding the letter. My grandmother's words were defending me from beyond the grave, but somehow that made me feel more exposed, not less. Clara never visited me because she wanted something from me. She came because she enjoyed my company. She never brought cameras to capture our moments together, never posted about our afternoons on social media. She simply showed up, time and time again, asking for nothing but my presence in return. "That's not fair," Victoria whispered, her voice breaking. "I loved her too. I called every week, I visited. But you performed those visits," I said quietly, finally looking at her. "You turned them into content for your Instagram stories, into talking points for your dinner parties. Spending quality time with Grandma Rose, with the perfectly filtered photos." Victoria's mouth opened and closed like she wanted to argue, but no words came. Because we both knew it was true. Her love had been real, but it had also been curated, packaged for public consumption. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat gently and continued reading. I remember the afternoon last summer when Clara helped me reorganize my home office. She spent 6 hours sorting through decades of business documents, never once complaining about the dust or the tedium. When we finished, she didn't take a single photo. She didn't mention it to anyone, she simply hugged me and said, "I'm glad I could help." That evening, I realized that this was love in its purest form, service without recognition, presence without performance. Mother finally spoke, her voice tight with emotion. "Rose, this isn't fair to Victoria. She worked so hard to maintain a relationship with you. She planned those visits, she scheduled them." I interrupted, surprising myself with my boldness. There's a difference between planning a relationship and living one. Father's head snapped up. "Clara, that's enough. Your sister loved your grandmother deeply." "I know she did," I said, and I meant it. But love isn't just about showing up when it's convenient, when it fits into your calendar between yoga classes and charity luncheons. Love is also about showing up when it's messy, when there's nothing to gain from it. Mr. Morrison was watching our exchange with the patient expression of someone who'd witnessed countless family dramas in this very room. When the voices died down, he resumed reading. Clara understands the value of quiet presence. She knows that some of life's most precious moments happen in the spaces between words. I am leaving her my business not because she has asked for it, but because she has the wisdom to know that true success isn't measured only in profit margins, but in the relationships we build and the trust we earn. Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous. Clara doesn't know anything about running a business. She works at a bookstore, for God's sake. She's never even expressed interest in Bennett and Associates." "Have you ever asked me what I'm interested in?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. The question hung in the air like smoke. Victoria stared at me, and I could see her mental wheels turning, searching for a conversation we'd never had, an interest she'd never inquired about. "I have an MBA, I continued quietly. "I've been working at the bookstore because I love books, not because it's my only option. I've been volunteering with small business development programs for 3 years, but none of you ever asked about that part of my life." Mother's expression shifted from indignation to something closer to confusion. "You never mentioned. You never asked," I repeated. "You were all so busy celebrating Victoria's achievements that you never wondered what I might be achieving in my own quiet way." Mr. Morrison's voice drew our attention back to the letter. "I am not giving Clara this inheritance to punish anyone, but to honor the qualities that our family has consistently undervalued. She has shown me that presence is more powerful than performance, that consistency matters more than charisma." The words settled over us like dust after an explosion. Victoria sank back into her chair, tears finally spilling over her carefully applied mascara. Mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue from her purse. Father looked like a man whose entire understanding of his family had just been rewritten. "There is one final provision," Mr. Morrison said, turning to the last page of the letter. "Clara, my dear granddaughter, I am trusting you with more than money and property. I am trusting you with the responsibility of taking care of this family in ways they may not even realize they need. You have the heart to forgive them for overlooking you, and the wisdom to help them see that love comes in many forms." He folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. Mrs. Bennett also left specific instructions that Clara should spend at least one night alone in the family home before making any decisions about the inheritance. She said, and I quote, "Some conversations can only happen in the spaces where love lived." I stared at the folded letter, feeling the weight of my grandmother's final gift, not just the money or the house or the business, but the validation I'd never known I was seeking. She had seen me, truly seen me, when everyone else was looking elsewhere. Victoria wiped her eyes and looked at me directly, for perhaps the first time all afternoon. "I don't understand why she chose you," she said, her voice raw but no longer angry. "But I'm beginning to think there's a lot about you I don't understand." It wasn't an apology, but it was a beginning. And in that moment, sitting in that conference room with the autumn light fading outside the windows, I realized that Grandmother Rose's greatest gift wasn't the inheritance itself. It was the opportunity she'd given us to finally see each other clearly. The drive to Grandmother Rose's house felt like traveling backward through time. Each familiar turn brought back memories I'd tucked away. The curve by Miller's farm, where she used to slow down so I could wave at the horses. The old stone bridge where we'd stop to watch the creek rush beneath us after spring rains. The brass key from my wallet felt warm in my palm as I pulled into the gravel driveway. 847 Maple Ridge Road sat nestled among towering oak trees, their October leaves creating a canopy of gold and crimson above the slate roof. The house itself was a study in quiet elegance, white clapboard siding, hunter green shutters, and a wraparound porch that had witnessed decades of family gatherings, summer evenings, and solitary mornings with coffee and newspapers. I sat in my car for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, and tried to process everything that had happened in that conference room. Victoria had left first, her heels clicking sharply down the hallway without a word to anyone. Mother and father had lingered, speaking in hushed tones with Mr. Morrison about legal procedures and timelines. I'd signed papers in a daze, my signature looking foreign on documents that transferred ownership of a life I was only beginning to understand. The key turned easily in the front door, as if the house had been waiting for me. Inside, everything was exactly as I remembered. The Persian rug in the entryway with its faded roses, the grandfather clock that chimed on the quarter hour, the smell of lavender and old books that seemed to live in the very walls. I set my purse on the hall table and walked slowly through the rooms, touching surfaces that held the imprint of my grandmother's daily life. Her reading glasses still sat folded beside her favorite chair. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay on the kitchen counter, her careful handwriting filling in words like resilience and devotion. The sight of it made my throat tighten with unexpected grief. In the living room, photographs lined the mantelpiece. Family portraits spanning decades, vacation snapshots, graduation pictures. I paused in front of one I'd never noticed before. Me at age 8, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting in Grandmother Rose's garden with dirt under my fingernails and a small pumpkin in my lap. She stood behind me, her hand resting on my shoulder, both of us squinting into autumn sunlight. I don't remember this being taken, I said aloud, my voice echoing in the quiet house. But as I looked closer, I realized there were several photos of me scattered throughout the collection, not formal poses, but candid moments. Me reading on the porch swing. Me helping her weed the flower beds. Me asleep in the window seat, with a book splayed across my chest. It was like discovering a secret archive of a relationship I'd thought was invisible to everyone else. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Can we talk? I'm at Starbucks on Main Street if you want to come by." I stared at the message for a long moment. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to stay cocooned in this house where I finally felt seen and valued. But Grandmother Rose's words from the letter echoed in my mind. "You have the heart to forgive them for overlooking you, and the wisdom to help them see that love comes in many forms." I texted back, "Come here instead. We should talk where she can hear us." 20 minutes later, Victoria's silver BMW pulled into the driveway. Through the window, I watched her sit behind the wheel for several minutes, staring at the house like she was gathering courage. When she finally emerged, she looked smaller somehow, diminished without her usual armor of professional confidence. I opened the front door before she could knock. She stood on the porch in her designer blazer and heels, looking oddly formal against the backdrop of autumn leaves and weathered wood. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi." We stood there for a moment, two sisters who'd shared a childhood, but had somehow become strangers along the way. Finally, I stepped aside to let her in. She walked through the entryway slowly, her eyes taking in details as if seeing them for the first time. "It looks exactly the same," she murmured. "She didn't like change for the sake of change," I replied, leading her into the living room. Victoria paused in front of the mantelpiece, her gaze moving across the photographs. She picked up the picture of me in the garden, studying it with something that looked like surprise. "I don't remember her taking so many pictures of you," she said, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity. "She didn't make a big production of it, no posing, no say cheese. She just captured moments." Victoria set the photo down carefully and turned to face me. "Clara, I need to understand something. Were you and Grandma Rose closer than I thought?" The question was vulnerable in its simplicity, stripped of the defensiveness I'd expected. I sat down in Grandmother Rose's chair, and Victoria perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded in her lap. "We were close in a different way than you two were," I said carefully. "Your relationship with her was more public. Mine was private. What does that mean?" I thought about how to explain it without diminishing what Victoria had shared with our grandmother. "You brought her into your world. You took her to your college graduation, your engagement party, your work events. You made her part of your story." Victoria nodded slowly. "And you?" I stepped into hers. "I came here on quiet Saturday afternoons, when there was nothing special happening. We'd work in the garden together, or she'd show me old photo albums, or we'd just sit on the porch and read separate books. I never posted about it because it felt too private to share." Tears welled in Victoria's eyes. "I thought those visits counted more because they were visible." because other people could see how much I cared about her. They did count, I said firmly. She loved those visits. She was so proud of your accomplishments, of how confident and successful you are, but she also needed the other kind of love, the kind that exists just for its own sake. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger or confusion, but something closer to respect. I've been thinking about what you said in the conference room, she said. About how no one ever asked what you were interested in. You're right, I never did. The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure how to cross. So I'm asking now, she continued. What are you interested in, Clara? What do you want to do with all of this? She gestured around the room, encompassing not just the house but the entire unexpected inheritance. It was such a simple question, but no one in our family had ever asked it before. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I'd carried for so long, I'd forgotten it was there. I want to help people, I said. Small business owners who are struggling, people who have good ideas but don't know how to make them work. Grandmother Rose built her consulting firm by helping family businesses succeed. I want to continue that, but expand it, make it more accessible. Victoria leaned forward, engaged despite herself. How? Free workshops, online resources, maybe scholarships for business development programs. The words came easier now. Ideas I'd been nurturing in private, finally finding voice. I want to use what she built to help people who remind me of, well, me. The ones who have something valuable to offer but don't know how to make themselves heard. For the first time since I'd known her, Victoria looked at me like I was someone worth listening to. That sounds incredible, Clara. It sounds like exactly what she would have wanted. Outside, the sun was setting behind the oak trees, casting long shadows across the porch, where Grandmother Rose and I had shared so many quiet conversations. Inside, her granddaughters were finally having the conversation she'd always hoped we'd find our way to, not about inheritance or family hierarchy, but about who we really were when we stopped performing for each other. Will you help me? I asked suddenly, surprising myself with the question. Victoria's eyebrows rose. Help you how? You're good at the things I'm not. Marketing, networking, making connections. If I'm going to expand the business, I'll need someone who knows how to make noise when noise is needed. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine one I'd seen from her all day. Are you offering me a job, little sister? I'm offering you a partnership. If you want it. She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her turning the idea over in her mind, weighing it against whatever future she'd planned for herself. What would Grandmother Rose think about that? She asked finally. I looked around the room, at the photographs that told the story of a woman who'd loved us both in different ways, who'd seen potential in places we'd never thought to look. I think, I said, she'd be proud of us for finally figuring it out. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal paperwork, business meetings, and awkward family dinners, where everyone seemed to be learning new steps to an old dance. I'd taken a leave of absence from the bookstore to sort through Grandmother Rose's affairs, and each day brought fresh discoveries about the woman I thought I'd known completely. Her home office, tucked into what had once been a sewing room, revealed the methodical mind behind Bennett and Associates. Filing cabinets held 20 years of client records, each folder meticulously organized and annotated in her careful handwriting. Sticky notes covered her desk calendar with reminders like follow up with Martinez Bakery expansion and research grant opportunities for Thompson Farm. She hadn't just run a business. She'd invested herself in dozens of small dreams. Victoria had surprised me by showing up the morning after our conversation, dressed in jeans and a Georgetown sweatshirt I'd never seen before, ready to help sort through boxes of documents. She worked with quiet efficiency, occasionally asking questions about clients or commenting on our grandmother's organizational systems. She has detailed notes about every family business she worked with, Victoria observed, holding up a thick folder labeled Riverside Diner 3 Generations. Look at this. She tracked not just their financials, but their family dynamics, their personal goals, even their kids' college plans. I looked over her shoulder at pages of handwritten notes spanning 15 years. Grandmother Rose had helped the Riverside Diner weather 2 recessions, a kitchen fire, and the transition from father to daughter management. The final entry, dated just 2 months before her death, read, Sarah is ready to expand to catering, discuss loan options and marketing strategy. Proud of how far this family has come. She cared about them as people, not just clients, I said softly. It's beautiful, Victoria replied, and I heard genuine admiration in her voice. I had no idea her work was so personal. That afternoon, we drove to the Bennett and Associates office downtown, a modest suite in a converted Victorian house that felt more like a cozy home than a traditional business space. Grandmother Rose's assistant, Mrs. Chen, had been managing the day-to-day operations since the funeral, but she greeted us with obvious relief. "Clara, thank goodness," she said, embracing me warmly. "Rose spoke of you so often. She was always saying, when Clara takes over, she'll understand what this business is really about." Victoria and I exchanged glances. "She talked about me taking over?" Mrs. Chen looked surprised. "Oh yes, for years. She said you had the right heart for this work, that you understood how to listen to what people weren't saying. She was just waiting for you to be ready." As Mrs. Chen showed us through the office, pointing out client files and ongoing projects, I felt the weight of Grandmother Rose's faith in me. She'd been preparing for this transition long before I'd known it was coming, quietly building a bridge between her work and my future. "We have 17 active clients right now," Mrs. Chen explained, pulling out a summary sheet. "Mostly family businesses, restaurants, farms, small manufacturing companies." Rose believed in helping people build something they could pass down to their children. Victoria picked up a framed photo from Grandmother Rose's desk, the old Riverside diner before its renovation, with 3 generations of the family standing proudly in front of their modest storefront. "She kept pictures of all her clients?" "The successful ones," Mrs. Chen smiled. She called them her victory wall. Rose always said the best part of her job was watching families find their footing. That evening, Victoria and I sat in Grandmother Rose's living room with Chinese takeout containers and a bottle of wine, surrounded by business files and legal documents. The grandfather clock chimed 8 o'clock, and I realized we'd been working together for nearly 10 hours without a single argument. "I've been thinking about your idea," Victoria said, twirling lo mein around her chopsticks. "The free workshops and online resources. What if we started with the existing clients? Asked them to share their stories, their challenges?" I looked up from the client list I'd been studying. "Like case studies?" "Exactly. Real examples of how the business development process works. People relate to stories more than abstract advice." She was getting animated now, the way she did when an idea excited her. "We could create a whole content library, videos, podcasts, blog posts, make the knowledge accessible to people who can't afford individual consulting." "That's brilliant," I said, meaning it. "You're thinking like a teacher, not just a marketer." Victoria paused mid-bite. "Is that good?" "It's perfect." Grandmother Rose was a teacher at heart. She just happened to teach business instead of literature. We worked until nearly midnight, sketching out ideas on the backs of envelopes and napkins. Victoria's marketing expertise, combined with my understanding of small business struggles, created something neither of us could have developed alone. I found myself genuinely excited about the future for the first time since the will reading. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was alone in the house, Victoria having gone back to her apartment to get fresh clothes, when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a woman about my age with curly red hair and paint-stained jeans. "Clara Bennett?" she asked when I opened the door. "I'm Sarah Kowalski from Riverside Diner. Mrs. Chen told me I might find you here." "Sarah?" I said, recognizing the name from the client files. "Please, come in. I was just going through my grandmother's notes about your business." She stepped into the entryway, looking around with obvious fondness. "I spent so many afternoons in this house, talking through problems with Rose. She had a way of helping you see solutions that were right in front of you all along." We settled in the living room with coffee, and Sarah told me about her relationship with Grandmother Rose, how they'd met when Sarah was a struggling single mother trying to keep her family's diner afloat, how Rose had helped her develop a business plan, secure funding, and eventually take over from her father. "She believed in me before I believed in myself," Sarah said. "When I wanted to give up, she'd say, 'Sarah, you're not just running a business, you're feeding a community. That matters.'" "She wrote that you're ready to expand into catering," I mentioned. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "We've got 3 wedding contracts lined up for next spring and 2 corporate clients interested in regular lunch delivery." Rose helped me crunch the numbers and develop a marketing strategy. "She said," Sarah paused, her eyes welling up. "She said she was proud of how far our family had come." After Sarah left, I sat in Grandmother Rose's chair and thought about legacy. Not the kind measured in dollars or real estate, but the kind that lived on in the dreams she'd helped nurture. The Riverside Diner was thriving because of her guidance. The Martinez Bakery had expanded to 3 locations. The Thompson Farm had successfully transitioned to organic certification. Each success story represented a family strengthened, a community fed, a dream realized. That's when I understood what Grandmother Rose had really left me. Not just a business, but a calling. Not just money, but the means to continue her work of helping people build something lasting. She'd given me the tools to help other quiet dreamers find their voices, the way she'd helped me find mine. When Victoria returned that afternoon, she found me surrounded by client success stories and scribbled notes about workshop curricula. "You look inspired," she observed, settling onto the couch beside me. "I think I'm finally understanding what she saw in me," I said. What she was preparing me for. Victoria picked up one of Sarah's business plans, covered in Grandmother Rose's encouraging marginalia. She saw someone who could carry on her real work, not just the consulting, but the caring. "Will you help me do that?" I asked. "Really help, not just with the marketing, but with the mission." Victoria was quiet for a moment, studying the photos on the mantelpiece, images of a woman who'd spent her life helping others build theirs. When she looked back at me, her expression was soft but determined. "I'd be honored to," she said. "I think it's time I learned what it means to build something that matters more than it shines." Outside, the October sun was setting behind the oak trees, casting the same golden light that had blessed countless conversations in this room. But for the first time, I felt like I was contributing to that legacy instead of just witnessing it. 3 months after the will reading, I stood in the renovated community center on Elm Street, watching Victoria adjust the microphone for our first public workshop. Building Dreams, a small business development series, was emblazoned across a banner that still smelled like fresh ink, and 43 people had registered for our inaugural session, more than double what we'd hoped for. The transformation hadn't been easy. Moving Bennett and Associates from its cozy Victorian office to this larger space had required navigating zoning permits, renovation contractors, and my own persistent anxiety about whether we were making the right choices. But seeing familiar faces like Sarah from Riverside Diner mixed with hopeful strangers clutching notebook and business plan drafts, I felt the rightness of it settle into my bones. "Testing, testing," Victoria spoke into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly through the room. She'd traded her usual designer blazers for more approachable outfits. Today it was dark jeans and a burgundy sweater that made her look competent but approachable. "Good? Okay, Clara, we're ready when you are." I smoothed my hands over my notes, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves that came before speaking to groups. Public speaking had never been my strength, but Victoria had helped me practice, teaching me that sharing knowledge was just another form of conversation, one I'd been having quietly for years. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "My name is Clara Bennett, and 3 months ago I inherited my grandmother's consulting business. But more than that, I inherited her belief that every family has the right to build something lasting." I told them about Grandmother Rose, about her wall of client success photos, about her conviction that business development was really about human development. I watched faces in the audience, some skeptical, some hopeful, all listening with the intensity of people who'd invested their evening in the possibility of change. "Tonight we're going to start with the most important question in business planning," I continued. "Not, how much money can I make, but what problem am I solving for my community?" Victoria clicked to the first slide, and we were off. For the next 2 hours, we guided participants through exercises designed to help them identify not just market opportunities, but personal missions. The energy in the room was electric. People sharing stories, asking questions, making connections with other dreamers they'd never met before. During the break, a young man named Marcus approached me. He was maybe 25, with calloused hands and the earnest expression of someone carrying a big dream and a small budget. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "I've been trying to start a landscaping business for 2 years, but every time I think I have it figured out, something goes wrong. Equipment breaks, clients don't pay on time, I underbid a job." He paused, frustration evident in his voice. "I'm starting to wonder if I'm just not cut out for this." I recognized the defeat in his tone. It was the same voice I'd heard in my own head for years, whispering that maybe I wasn't meant for bigger things. "Tell me about your best day working in landscaping," I said. His whole demeanor changed. "Last spring, I helped this elderly couple redesign their backyard. They'd been struggling to maintain it since Mr. Peterson's stroke, but they didn't want to give up their garden. We created these raised beds, installed an irrigation system, chose plants that would be beautiful but low maintenance." He smiled for the first time since approaching me. When I finished, Mrs. Peterson cried. She said I'd given them their sanctuary back. "That's your mission," I said simply. "You're not just cutting grass or planting flowers. You're helping people maintain their connection to the earth, their sense of home." Victoria had been listening from nearby, and she joined our conversation. "Marcus, have you considered specializing in accessible landscaping? Gardens designed for people with mobility challenges or aging in place?" His eyes widened. No, I hadn't thought of that specifically. But I love that kind of work. There's your niche, Victoria said. Instead of competing with every landscaper in town on price, you compete on expertise and heart. That's a sustainable business model. I watched Marcus leave that night with contact information for 3 other participants who'd expressed interest in his services, plus a referral to a nonprofit that worked with disabled veterans who might need accessible outdoor spaces. This was what Grandmother Rose had meant about teaching people to fish instead of just handing them a meal. After the last participant left, Victoria and I sat in the empty community center, surrounded by stacked chairs and the lingering energy of shared dreams. "That was incredible," Victoria said, pulling her hair out of its professional bun. "Did you see how Marcus lit up when he talked about the Petersons' garden? And the way everyone started connecting with each other during the networking portion," I added. "Sarah ended up talking to that baker about supplying desserts for her catering events." Victoria kicked off her heels and curled up in one of the remaining chairs. "I have to admit something, Clara. When I first heard about the inheritance, I was angry. Not just about the money, but about what it represented. I thought Grandma Rose was saying I wasn't good enough, that all my achievements didn't matter to her." I waited, recognizing the vulnerability in her admission. "But watching you tonight, seeing how you connected with people like Marcus, I understand now. She wasn't choosing you over me, she was choosing the right person for the job. And she knew I'd figure out how to be part of it in my own way." "You were amazing tonight," I said. "The way you helped Marcus see his niche, how you managed the logistics so smoothly. I couldn't do this without you." "We make a good team," Victoria agreed. "Different strengths, same values." My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. "Rose would be so proud." Watched the live stream from home and cried happy tears. "You're carrying on her heart, not just her business." I showed the message to Victoria, who smiled softly. "She's right, you know, about Grandma Rose being proud. I can feel her here." Looking around the community center, at the banner with our names on it, at the registration table where people had signed up for future workshops, at the whiteboard still covered with business ideas and connection points, I felt it too. Not just Grandmother Rose's presence, but her legacy taking on new life. "I've been thinking about our next steps," I said. "What if we created a mentorship program? Paired established business owners with newcomers?" Victoria's eyes lit up. "Like Sarah mentoring someone who wants to start a restaurant?" "Exactly. And we could have specialized tracks: retail, food service, professional services. Build a whole community of people supporting each other." "I love it," Victoria said. "We could call it the Rose Bennett Network." The name settled over us like a blessing. Rose Bennett Network. Not just honoring our grandmother's memory, but embodying her belief in the power of quiet growth, sustained relationships, and dreams nurtured with patience and care. As we locked up the community center and walked to our cars under the November stars, I thought about how much had changed since that cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox. I'd inherited a business, yes, but I'd also inherited a family relationship I'd never thought possible, and a confidence in my own voice I'd never imagined I could possess. "Same time next week?" Victoria asked, settling behind the wheel of her BMW. "Same time next week," I confirmed. "Though I think we might need a bigger room." She laughed, the sound carrying across the empty parking lot. Good problem to have. Driving home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, I passed the Riverside Diner with its glowing windows and, now hiring sign. Sarah's expansion was working. I passed the Martinez Bakery, closed for the night but with a new banner advertising their second location opening soon. I passed a dozen small businesses that were thriving, growing, employing neighbors and feeding families, and proving that dreams, tended with care, could bloom into something beautiful. At home, I made myself a cup of tea, Earl Grey with honey, just like Grandmother Rose preferred, and sat in her favorite chair to plan next week's workshop. The house still smelled like lavender and old books, but now it also carried the scent of possibility, of a legacy being lovingly transformed, rather than simply preserved. Tomorrow, I'd call Marcus to check on his progress. I'd review applications for our mentorship program. I'd meet with the community college about partnering on business education courses. But tonight I simply sat in the quiet gratitude of work that mattered, surrounded by the loving presence of a woman who'd taught me that the most important inheritance isn't money, it's the courage to help others find their way. 6 months into our new venture, success arrived wearing an expensive suit and carrying problems I hadn't anticipated. Regional Business Development magazine wanted to feature the Rose Bennett Network in their spring issue. A venture capital firm from Boston had reached out about scaling our model. 3 other communities had inquired about franchising opportunities. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know how two sisters had transformed a small consulting practice into what the business press was calling the future of community-driven entrepreneurship. I stood in our expanded office space. We'd taken over the entire first floor of the community center, watching Victoria field calls from reporters and investors. She handled the attention with grace, but I could see the familiar gleam in her eye, the one that appeared whenever opportunity knocked loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Clara," she called out, covering the mouthpiece of her phone. "The venture capital people want to schedule a video call for next week. They're talking about a $2 million investment to expand into 5 more cities. $2 million. The number should have excited me, but instead it settled in my stomach like a stone. I thought about Marcus, who'd just landed his 3rd accessible landscaping contract, and sent me a photo of himself teaching a gardening workshop at the senior center. I thought about Sarah, whose catering business was thriving specifically because she'd been able to grow slowly, maintaining the personal touch that made her food special. "Tell them we'll consider it," I said, though my heart wasn't in the words. That afternoon, while Victoria was at a lunch meeting with a marketing consultant who specialized in scaling social impact enterprises, I found myself walking through downtown Millbrook. The Martinez Bakery's 2nd location was bustling with customers. The Riverside Diner had a line out the door for their new weekend brunch service. Henderson's Hardware, whose owner had attended our 3rd workshop, had expanded into online sales and hired 2 part-time employees. This was the impact we'd dreamed of. Real businesses serving real people, growing at a pace that felt sustainable rather than explosive. But as I watched the genuine interactions between business owners and customers, I wondered if success was about to complicate everything we'd built. My phone rang as I passed the old Victorian house that had once housed Bennett and Associates. "Clara? It's Mrs. Chen. Do you have a minute to talk?" "Always," I said, settling onto a bench in Memorial Park. "I've been watching all the attention your work is getting," she said, her voice carrying a note of concern I'd rarely heard before. Rose used to worry about this exact thing. What would happen if the business became more about the business than about the people it served? "What do you mean?" She had offers over the years, people who wanted to buy her client list, consultants who wanted to partner with her to expand regionally. She always said no. Not because she didn't want to help more people, but because she was afraid that getting bigger would mean getting less personal. I closed my eyes, thinking about the Rose Bennett Network's waiting list of over 200 people, about the venture capital firm's promise to systematize our methodology for maximum impact, about Victoria's excitement over scaling opportunities. "Mrs. Chen, what would you do if you were me?" There was a long pause. I'd ask myself what Rose would choose if she were here today. Not what would make the most money or get the most attention, but what would help the most people in the truest way. That evening, Victoria came home to the house on Maple Ridge Road. She'd been staying there more often as our work intensified, with takeout from Riverside Diner and an expression I recognized as barely contained excitement. "The marketing consultant had the most incredible ideas," she said, spreading containers across the kitchen table. "She thinks we could have Rose Bennett Network chapters in 20 cities within 2 years. The venture capital firm is talking about developing an app that would connect entrepreneurs with mentors automatically. We could help thousands of people, Clara." I picked at my salad, listening to her enthusiasm while feeling increasingly unsettled. What about the people we're already helping, the community we've built here? "We'd still have that," Victoria said quickly. "But imagine what we could do with real resources. Professional development programs, seed funding for startups, marketing support for established businesses. We could be like the Grameen Bank of small business development." Her vision was compelling, backed by statistics and market research, and the kind of strategic thinking that had made her successful in her previous career. But something about it felt wrong, like trying to force a wildflower garden into neat, geometric rows. "I need to think about it," I said. "Of course. But, Clara, opportunities like this don't wait forever." The consultant said we should strike while the iron is hot, while we have media attention and investor interest. After Victoria went to bed, I found myself in Grandmother Rose's study, surrounded by her client files and personal journals. I pulled out the leather-bound book I'd discovered months ago, the one with her observations about me, and flipped through pages of her careful handwriting. One entry, dated just a year before her death, caught my attention. "Clara came by today to help reorganize the basement storage. No special occasion, no agenda. We worked for 3 hours in comfortable silence, and when we finished, she said, 'I like helping you make things orderly.' That's when I knew she understood the real work. Not the flashy consultations or the big contracts, but the patient, daily practice of helping people build something stable." I kept reading, finding entry after entry about the importance of staying connected to individual stories, of resisting the pressure to grow faster than wisdom could follow. In one passage, she'd written, "Success isn't measured by how many people you reach, but by how deeply you reach the people who need you most." The next morning, I called a meeting with Victoria and Mrs. Chen at the community center. I'd prepared notes, but when we sat down together in the workshop space where we'd launched our first program, I found myself speaking from my heart instead. "I've been thinking about the expansion opportunities," I began, "and I think we need to say no." Victoria's face fell. "Clara, this could be huge for us, for the communities we could serve." "But what kind of service would it be?" I asked gently. "Think about Marcus, about Sarah, about all the people who've come through our workshops. They didn't need a systemized program or an app-based matching service. They needed someone to listen to their specific story, to understand their particular challenges, to connect them with exactly the right resources at exactly the right time." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "Rose always said that good consulting was like good gardening. You can't rush the growing season, and you can't treat every plant the same way." "But we could help so many more people," Victoria protested, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Or we could help fewer people better," I said. "What if instead of expanding to 20 cities, we went deeper here? What if we created the most comprehensive, most supportive small business ecosystem in New England? What if we became the model that other communities could adapt to their own needs, rather than trying to franchise our exact approach?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at downtown Millbrook, where businesses we'd helped were opening their doors for another day of serving their neighbors. "You're right," she said finally. "I got caught up in the excitement of scaling, but that's not what this work is about. It's about relationships, not reach." Mrs. Chen smiled. "Rose would be proud of both of you. Victoria for having the vision to see possibilities, and Clara for having the wisdom to choose the right ones." That afternoon, Victoria called the venture capital firm and politely declined their offer. She called the magazine and asked them to focus their article on our community partnerships rather than our expansion plans. She called the marketing consultant and thanked her for her ideas, while explaining that we'd decided to grow differently. "How do you feel about it?" I asked as we walked home through downtown, past businesses that knew our names and children who waved from restaurant windows. "Like we just chose substance over flash," Victoria said. "It feels right, scary, but right." Grandmother Rose always said the best decisions feel scary at first, because they require you to trust yourself more than external validation. Victoria laughed. "When did you become so wise?" "I think I always was," I said, surprised by my own certainty. I just needed to learn to trust it. That night, I wrote in the journal I'd started keeping, following Grandmother Rose's example of documenting the small moments that revealed big truths. Today, Victoria and I chose depth over breadth, relationship over reach. We turned down money and attention in favor of meaning and connection. I think this is what inheritance really looks like. Not just receiving what someone leaves you, but choosing to carry forward what matters most. Outside my window, Millbrook slept peacefully, its small businesses and family dreams tucked safely into the darkness, ready to grow another day in the patient, persistent way that real things grow. One conversation, one relationship, one quiet success at a time. 1 year after the will reading that changed everything, I stood in the garden behind 847 Maple Ridge Road, watching Victoria teach our parents how to plant the memorial rose bush we'd chosen for Grandmother Rose. The late afternoon sun filtered through the oak trees, casting the same golden light that had blessed so many quiet conversations in this space. "A little deeper, Dad," Victoria instructed, guiding Father's hands as he worked the soil. "Rose bushes need room for their roots to spread." Mother knelt beside them, carefully removing the burlap from around the plant's root ball. She'd been different since our decision to decline the venture capital offer, softer somehow, more present. Last month, she'd attended one of our workshops, not as a skeptical observer, but as someone genuinely interested in understanding the work we were doing. "Clara," she'd said afterward, "I owe you an apology. I spent so many years assuming I knew who you were that I never bothered to discover who you were becoming." Now, watching her gentle hands tend to something that would bloom long after we were gone, I saw echoes of the woman who'd raised 2 daughters, who'd navigated her own quiet struggles while supporting a family. We were all more complex than the roles we'd played for each other. The Rose Bennett Network had grown in ways I'd never anticipated, though not in the direction those Boston investors had envisioned. We now had mentor partnerships with 12 established businesses, scholarship programs funded by successful alumni, and a waiting list managed not by impersonal algorithms but by Mrs. Chen's careful attention to each person's specific needs and timing. Marcus had become one of our most dedicated mentors, teaching accessible landscaping workshops twice a month, and employing 3 part-time assistants. Sarah had expanded into corporate catering while maintaining the personal touch that made her food special. The Martinez family had opened their 3rd bakery location and started a program training young people in traditional baking techniques. But the most meaningful growth had been harder to quantify. Relationships had deepened. A community had formed. People who'd met in our workshops now collaborated on projects, supported each other through challenges, celebrated successes together. We'd built something that felt less like a business development program and more like an extended family. "There," Victoria said, stepping back to admire our work. The rosebush looked small in its new home, but I could envision it 5 years from now, established, blooming, providing beauty for seasons to come. Father brushed dirt from his hands and looked around the garden with the expression of someone seeing it clearly for the first time. "Rose would have loved this," he said quietly. She always said gardens were about faith in the future. We stood together in comfortable silence, 4 people who'd learned to see each other differently over the course of a year, marked by grief, discovery, and unexpected grace. The grandfather clock chimed from inside the house. 6 o'clock, time for the dinner we'd planned to celebrate what would have been Grandmother Rose's 76th birthday. As we gathered the gardening tools, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text. She glanced at it and smiled. "It's from the Boston venture capital firm. They're asking if we've reconsidered their offer." "What are you going to tell them?" Father asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Victoria looked at me, then at the small rose bush we'd just planted, then at the house where 3 generations of women had learned to love in different ways. "I'm gonna tell them we're already invested in something that's growing beautifully." Inside, the dining room table was set with Grandmother Rose's good china and the silver candlesticks that had belonged to her mother. Mrs. Chen had joined us, along with Sarah and her teenage daughter Emma, who'd started helping with our workshop registrations after school. This had become our tradition, celebrating Grandmother Rose's birthday not with mourning, but with the kind of dinner party she would have loved. Good food, meaningful conversation, and people who'd been brought together by her legacy. "Before we eat," I said, raising my glass of the wine Victoria had chosen from Grandmother Rose's collection, "I want to share something I found in her papers this week." I pulled out a letter I'd discovered tucked inside her recipe box, not addressed to anyone in particular, but clearly written for this moment, for this gathering that she'd somehow known would happen. "If you're reading this together," I began, reading her words aloud, "then you've figured out what I always hoped you would. That love isn't a limited resource that gets divided among people, but an unlimited one that multiplies when it's shared." Mother's eyes filled with tears. Victoria reached over to squeeze her hand. I continued reading. "Clara, my quiet granddaughter, you've learned to trust your voice. Victoria, my shining star, you've learned the beauty of depth over dazzle. Margaret and Robert, you've learned to see both your daughters clearly. And all of you have learned that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property, but the capacity to help each other become who you're meant to be." The letter went on to describe her hopes for the business, for our family, for the community we'd all become part of. But the final paragraph was what made everyone at the table pause. "The greatest gift you can give someone isn't solving their problems for them, but believing in their ability to solve those problems themselves." That's what I tried to give each of you, in different ways, at different times. Keep passing that gift forward, keep believing in people's capacity to grow. Keep creating spaces where quiet voices can be heard and shy dreams can take root. That's how love becomes legacy. After dinner, as we cleaned up and said our goodbyes, Victoria and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen where this whole journey had begun, with a cream-colored envelope and a cup of Earl Grey tea. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Grandmother Rose had divided the inheritance equally?" Victoria asked, drying the good china with unusual care. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I think she knew we needed to discover each other this way. You needed to see that I had something valuable to offer, and I needed to see that you could value substance over performance." Victoria set down the plate she'd been drying and looked at me seriously. "Clara, I need you to know something. This year working with you has been the most fulfilling of my life. Not because of the recognition we've received, but because of the work itself. Because of who I've become doing it." "Me too," I said. "Though I think we've both just become more ourselves, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense. Grandmother Rose saw who we really were before we did." Later that evening, after Victoria had gone back to her apartment and our parents had driven home with promises to visit again soon, I sat in Grandmother Rose's favorite chair, with a cup of tea and the journal I'd been keeping throughout this transformative year. The house was quiet, except for the familiar sounds that had comforted me since childhood. The grandfather clock's steady tick, the old pipe settling, the October wind rustling through the oak trees. I wrote about the day, about the rose bush that would bloom for years to come, about the family dinner that would have made Grandmother Rose smile with satisfaction. But mostly I wrote about inheritance, not the kind that arrives in legal documents, but the kind that passes from heart to heart, generation to generation, in the form of values lived and love shared. The brass key that had started this journey still sat in my wallet, though I'd long since discovered what it opened. Not a physical lock, but the understanding that some gifts can't be given. They can only be recognized, accepted, and passed forward. Outside my window, Millbrook slept peacefully under autumn stars. Tomorrow would bring new workshops, new mentees, new opportunities to help people build something lasting. Sarah would perfect another catering menu. Marcus would design another accessible garden. Dozens of small dreamers would take another step toward making their quiet hopes real. But tonight, I simply sat in gratitude for the inheritance I'd received and the inheritance I was becoming. A woman who believed in the power of patient love, persistent faith, and the revolutionary act of helping others discover their own voices. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, and I smiled, thinking of Grandmother Rose's words. Some conversations can only happen in the spaces where love lived. This whole year had been one long conversation with her memory, with my family, with my community, and finally, with myself. And the conversation was far from over. It was just beginning to bloom, like the rose bush we'd planted today, like the relationships we'd nurtured, like the legacy we were all learning to carry forward, one quiet act of faith at a time. In the margin of my journal, I wrote one final note. True inheritance is not what you receive, but what you choose to give. Thank you, Grandmother Rose, for teaching me the difference. And in the peaceful silence of the house that had sheltered 3 generations of strong women, I felt her presence like a blessing, approving not just of what I'd inherited, but of what I was becoming with it.